Welcome everybody online and in person for this second conversation of our spring series. Just as a reminder for a little bit of context, the conversations of the Center for Design are meant to explore new directions for research. We're trying to shape our agenda, thinking about what might be good research on in the future. And so we try to invite new potential partners and people we would like to work with maybe in the future. So we touch on many different topics. There's some examples of what we have been exploring in the past, and I'm particularly like this new topic. And I've been always passionate about the idea of things, non-human actors and agencies potentially. So I'm really excited about this panel you put together, and Kristian and Grisha. So the floor is yours to introduce the candidates. Before that, just promoting our Design Research Week that is happening soon. This is yet another way we are trying to express all the potential of design as a research operator. And we'll touch again on very different topics. It's a full week of events, hybrid events that you can join. Just search for that online and see the full program. It's very dense, and I hope that's interesting to this audience. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Paolo. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristian Kloeckl, Associate Professor here at Northeastern University in the Department of Design in the School of Architecture, designer. And I've been working at this nexus of design and performance over the past years, looking at improvisation frameworks, and how we can fold them into the way we design with responsive technologies, particularly in the context of hybrid cities, where I became interested how these technologies allow for interactions between humans and spaces, environments that go beyond what needs to be scripted, programmed, and planned, and can remain open for an ongoing conversational dynamic of back and forth. Just to frame this briefly, and before passing it on to Grisha as my co-host, considering what gets us from the design side to look at performance, it's worthwhile to considering the performative turn as something a bit broader. In linguistics, the performative turn, the turn to performance, refers to how individuals actually make use of language rather than the language in itself. It's really looking at how someone actually says something with all the slip-ups, hesitations, pauses, glitches. Social sciences and humanities also had their performative turn, looking at culture not as something that can be read like a text, but it's something that is being performed in the moment and in context. And so similarly, a bit in line with what we've heard before from Paolo, the performative term in design allows us to look beyond the artifact, beyond the object, the thing, the system, the constructed environment as such, and really focus on how people actually carry out everyday acts and activities in their circumstances, in their time, in their moment. So it's not about the shape and structure of the table, but it's about the actual act of having a conversation. As we're having here, it's not so much the shape and structure of a staircase, like a spiral staircase out there, but it's the actual acts of individuals moving between floors, skipping steps, meeting friends, pausing, what they actually do, and how this act of shifting from one floor to the next actually unfolds over time in a specific place. On the other hand, there are the actual physical and constructed environments and constructed contexts, which also over the past years, with the emergence of sensor-based technologies, have in certain ways become activated. Physical things, constructed environments aren't anymore passive backdrops for human activity, but in their own right are able to pick up dynamics of activity and adjust and adapt and dynamically respond to these. And so in a way, these physical artifacts in their own way can be viewed as performing in interaction with humans, facilitating performances between humans. And that's a bit what we're focusing on. We've got two exciting guest speakers and my wonderful co-host, Kristian, so I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome, thank you. Hi, thank you, Kristian. Thanks for coming. My name is Ruairi Glynn, and when Kristian asked me to co-host, to think about this panel, we went back and forth with the title, like design and performance, or performance and objects, or, you know, architecture and performance. Whoa. And that was all like, okay, but what are we talking about? And so finally we went back and forth, and I was like, how about things perform us? And, you know, it's an intentional inversion. One of the inspirations that I've gotten from working with the PhD students this semester is this idea of building systems that are non-hierarchical, or what that would mean in typical sort of creative media or creation in relation to, we could say objects generally, but technology in particular, things that have sense and sensibility. We think about like data in, or input and analysis and output, like very generally speaking. But instead of that, in sort of like the human is obviously the one that determines a thing, and then the object responds or gets broken or all these things. I was thinking, well, what do we do on a kind of daily basis with our responsive and unresponsive non-human objects in the world? And how can we be a little bit more aware of how we work with it? And actually, not just the performative turn of what we say, but also how we move, and how our very presence, how our bodies, how our non-language based or non-text based, language based ideas are expressed in relation to this table. Do you know what I mean? And so you can actually have a shape oriented relationship to a thing that speaks volumes. That, you know, say, you know, I'm really feeling sad today, or I'm feeling quite heavy. I think I'm gonna lay my head on the table. You know, you could talk about it, but you could also work with the shape of it. So I think that that's also interesting in relation to this idea of the performative turn. The last thing I'll say is, with performance and stuff, you can performance, and I think I'm going to speak to this with Elliot and also in the work that I do. Performance is like an extreme version of it, a dramatization of a thing, and allowing, like, making more space for maybe the quotidien or the daily, those possibilities to be a bit more expanded. So your relationship with your objects, and I think we'll see that in Elliot's work, see it in my work, but I'll share that later. It's kind of like, it has to do with this weird thing of how much would you push it? How much could you push an object? And in this context, we're pushing objects. Oh, well, you can't see it, but I can. That we're pushing objects to kind of critique or speak back on the modern way. Okay, so you're a modern way. Okay, anyway, you got the point. Yes, that was
Technical capabilities.
Yes, sorry. Okay. Elliot Reed is a director, performer, and visual artist based in New York. They are a former artist in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem, participant of the Whitney Museum Independent Studio Program, and a Dance WEB WEB fellow. Elliot earned his MA in choreography from the Institut Chorégraphique International, CCN Montpellier, France. Elliot's work is presented at festivals, galleries, and museums internationally, including the Lucerne Festival, Metro Pictures, MoMA PS1, Centro de la Madrid. Okay, there you go. The Getty Museum, the Hammer Museum, Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, and other venues in London, Tokyo, Osaka, and Mexico City. So please welcome Elliot Reed.
Cool. I'm super excited to be here. I work across a lot of different types of mediums, whether it's like sculpture, installation, performance. I'm also really excited some people came in and sat in the front. This is like the splash zone is always like a dangerous place. If this is not SeaWorld, there'll be no like giant jumping killer whales spraying water upon them even sitting here. I am just going to show some photos of recent exhibitions I've been doing and kind of talk about how I connect that to what we'll be talking about today. So here's some of my like performance and installations I've been working on for the past couple of years. So the first one I'll talk about is a show called Rhythm that I did at Kloeckl in Switzerland a few years back. I chose to show this exhibition because I think it occupies a really interesting space between installation and performance. I think a lot about the ways that liveness can be expressed, not just through the body of someone who's interacting with media, but also with people who are viewing something. So I used a lot of performative gestures within this installation: scale, distance, volume. This is when you first walk into the second floor of the show. My biggest sculpture is kind of at the far end of a gallery there. So when you walk into the room, you kind of approach this installation. So how it works is I actually created a second wall to scale of the museum and installed it in the corners. And when you get up close, you learn this piece is actually, it's 100 knives that are sort of like stabbed into the wall at a perfect 45-degree angle. And I'll go back one. The last knife at the left side of the screen is like at head height, which is supposed to be a riff on this notion of like the artist's hand. Has anyone like heard of that concept before? So the artist's hand is sort of just like when you're making something like a drawing or a painting or a sculpture, it's the idea that an object carries the touch of the person who made it. So it's a little bit different than like industrial design, where even though the hand of the maker is still involved, by the time something gets like catted out, mass produced, like I think people don't look for the same notion of like a fingerprint or like a gesture of a stroke, you know, in a teapot as you would in like an oil painting or something. And so that tension is interesting to me in this piece because I'm working with prefabricated materials, custom, all made to spec, but trying to bring in this idea that like the body or like my body is like always present, even though it's not being represented in the material in like a traditional way. So this is one half of the piece. And so when you flip to the other side of the exhibition, there's two videos. So the one on the bottom left is like an old school CRT monitor that actually has like a video of me jump roping facing towards a wall. This is the only piece in the room that's making sound, and it's really loud and sort of like it's like a whack, whack, whack kind of sound. That I intentionally put at a really low angle, kind of in the back of the room. It's the kind of thing that echoes in this really gorgeous, like voluminous space. You can kind of like hear it and feel it before you enter in, all kind of like coloring your experience of interacting like with the exhibition and sort of making something that's larger than it seems. So yeah, here's like a little close-up of the video. It's intentionally really small and kind of meant to get swallowed up, but you can hear it pretty bright in space. And then the last video in this room is me. What I'm doing in it, it's like a 5-minute silent loop. And I'm kind of using these hand gestures to sort of like pull parts of my face around. I was thinking about like, the whole show is about making work about the body not being present while still acknowledging kind of like the hand of its maker. So when you think of performance or any kind of like body-based medium, the person doing it is kind of like the canvas for the work, just like if I was like, pouring concrete, like that would be the material. And so the riff is like, I was trying to like draw with my face, which is obviously like a failed exercise. Like this stuff is pretty fixed, it can like wiggle a little bit, but it's my eyes, God willing, will stay where they are. But yeah, I'm sort of like on this white background, kind of like a sheet of paper, thinking about like my actual flesh is like a base for inquiry or kind of like expanded practice, I guess. So this is the first floor of the show. And so the second half of the installation is composed also of two parts. So you walk down the hallway in the second level of the museum and you enter in this like green room. And who recognizes this color? Beyond green, but has anyone ever done like have you heard of chroma key before? Yeah, so chroma key is kind of like well now they use blue, but it's kind of like this technology they use on like a TV set for like the news, where they have like that crazy neon green background where they edit in the color. So the reason I chose that specific shade of green is because it represents like a digital ground or sort of like a space where nothing exists, you can kind of like digitally project onto. Obviously, I'm not using cameras on this color, but I'm taking something that sort of exists in our contemporary space as material and kind of projecting that back into space. There's sound, which you can't hear in this, but it's a 30-minute audio wash where it's kind of like an inverted stereo recording that's sort of meant to, I guess, like refresh the viewer. It's just like an all-encompassing sort of like entrance into the next space. So you walk through this sort of like faux digital neutral kind of space, and then this is looking back in the hallway. Then you get here. This sculpture, it's a series of motorcycles that I actually put MP3 players in the back. You can kind of see if you like follow the cord to like the tailpipe of these bikes. So each of these motorcycles has a recording of my breath. But what I did is I digitally edited out all of the exhales, so it just goes with like digital silence. And then the color that I was doing, I was kind of inspired by like a stoplight in reverse. So these motorcycles are all facing towards the door when you walk in, sort of kind of like primed for motion or primed for use, without ever kind of like fully executing their purpose in a way. And I picked these sort of racing style motorcycles because of the way that they're designed. I think that they're such a beautiful acknowledgement of the human form, because like in the most perfect way, these types of bikes are made to just accommodate one person. You know, you can just like slide into it almost like, yeah, there's something very like post-human about these kind of bikes that I like. And this sort of like threat of like speed or activity, or sort of like this effortless sort of, transmutation to like the mechanized other was exciting to me. All right, so that's one exhibition that I did. Here's a performance I did in New York called You Can Hear Footsteps. The opening image for this one, I'm actually suspended from a wire inside of the theater. I cheated the perspective of the audience at a 45-degree angle because I was thinking a lot about locations like wrestling rings or like a monster truck rally, or like the idea of like some big like stadium show in miniature. So I'm kind of creating this like hyper compressed spectacle space that I think forces the viewer to like really think about like what their relationship is in to connection with the performers on stage. When I'm on a wire, like in my notes, my image I was thinking about was like a piece of like meat or something, where it's like, what does it mean to sort of like become an object that actually belongs to the theater, and not just someone who's kind of like behaving inside of it. So in that way, I think this small gesture successfully like encompasses the entirety of the theater as like an object, or that was the goal. To sort of, as people are walking in, to get them to think about like, okay, you're not just watching a show, but like the second you open the door, this is like a designed environment that from step one is kind of invented to consider what our bodies are in relationship to viewing and being viewed. So people come, they walk in, they sit down. I get lowered down after a while from the wire. After that, there's these sort of, I guess you can see it here. I worked with a video designer to have these like LED light panels, like again, something you can see at like a rock show or like a concert. Those were playing bits of text that were clips from an audio track that's playing. There's kind of like a voiceover in this portion. The piece then transitions into like a bit of like a dance solo. This part's funny. I crawl underneath the chairs and pull a microphone out from underneath the people sitting, and the signs start to function a bit like a magic 8-ball. So I like ask the audience questions, and then there's like I don't have control over it, but there's like a bank of I think 20 responses. I can't remember what night what this person asks, but this is the theater had to respond back to the person who spoke. So the piece keeps going. Okay, so I'll pause here. The piece is about a 50-minute long dance, but I don't know if you can see in the background, there's like some bodies in the corner. This whole time I actually had dancers really slowly crawl out in the pitch black. And because I cheated the view so close to the front, it kind of played tricks on your eyes a little bit. You can't really see people. And then so the big finale, everyone's kind of like revealed, and then it's like a huge 30-person ensemble. We finish up, it's gorgeous, everyone sobs, we all got Tony Awards. And then like this final moment, there's kind of like I have another actress that comes out and does a voiceover over this white stage. And then there's more screens in the ceiling. I can talk more about this in Q&A, but I'm okay, like 2 minutes. I'm just gonna go through another installation I did. So this is a MoMA PS1, it's called This Longing Vessel. The first thing I think I'd want to bring attention to in this show is actually the walls. The walls in this show are painted the same shade of brown as like the skin on my right hand, which is my dominant hand. So I was thinking a lot about like injury or sort of like prepared flesh in the way of like a tanned leather or like, you know, a bound book or something. And so every artwork within the gallery space becomes like a sore, right? Kind of, for lack of a better term. This is a sculpture where it's like my body weight made out of pickling salt, which maybe I'll tell the story of that later. Worked with the string quartet for a video, and then this is, I wanted to detail on this. This is like an artwork called Hole. So similar to the piece with the knives I showed you guys earlier, I actually cheated the video installation 1.5 feet out from the wall and backlit it, but it's installed in a corner in a way that you can't see what's behind it, because if you go to the corner, your shoulder will hit the side, you can't actually get around. So a metaphor for just like things being like out of reach, or sort of, you know, being led on, or sort of like an unfulfilled promise, or, you know, however you want to take it. And then these are a performative object that I make called placeholders. It's like an ongoing series of these. This one's like 8 by 9 feet, solid aluminum that I have powder coated at a factory, and then I do a tone on tone 3M reflective text on it. That is. So here is the piece head on, and then from the side, you can see the text kind of pops out. Interested in sort of, yeah, ways that objects can sort of speak beyond the limitations of their form. And I like this sort of tone on tone thing because you can make words that kind of hide in plain sight. There's a blue one, and thank you.
Thanks, Elliot. I'd like now to introduce our second speaker who's joining us from London. Ruairi Glynn is an associate professor at the Bartlett School of Architecture at the UCL London. He's the founder of the Interactive Architecture Lab and the founder of that lab's own transdisciplinary Masters in Design for Performance and Interaction. Alongside his teaching and research, he practices as an installation artist and has recently exhibited at the Centre Pompidou Paris, the National Art Museum of China, Beijing, and the Tate Modern in London. Ruairi's interactive installations reflect on rapid developments in robotics, material science, and computational technologies, all examining the emerging aesthetics of behavior that's permeating across art, architecture, and design. And with this, I'd like to welcome Ruairi. Thanks for joining us, and look forward to hearing about it.
Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly, yes.
Okay, great. Right, well, thank you for the invitation. Let me get something up on screen immediately to see if it's working. And then go from there. There we go. We got something? All right. So yeah, thank you for the invitation to join this transdisciplinary gathering. And I really I love the new title to the meeting, to the things perform us. I think it's very provocative and wonderful. And I wanted to make a contribution in this time I have about well, thinking about how things themselves are becoming increasingly lively or animate in the way that they perform as a result of chiefly advances in AI and robotics, but you could also maybe add advancements in materials, and there are, I think, some important contributions from the arts too. And there's a clear shift at the moment going on from user-slave models of interaction towards what I call neo-cybernetic models, but people might more simply call them participatory models or conversational models, where artificial and organic life act and adapt and change over time in much richer forms of exchange than the types that I was familiar with growing up with my first Atari STE, or even my first Windows machines, and all the way through to my early smartphones, which were very much of a kind of user-slave model. Yeah, I apologize that I can't be with you in person. Unfortunately, circumstances mean that I have to join you remotely, but thank you very much for putting up with this. And I hope the distance won't hamper the conversation too much. So I'll introduce myself while I show you a bit of work from my lab, which I've been running at the UCL, University College London, for a decade. And it includes some work from master's and PhD students that have come through the lab, as well as commercial and research projects that we've done with staff. I'm going to today mostly talk about my own personal artistic practice, just because of the time that we have for this bit of the meeting. So, but my arts practice runs in parallel to teaching and has very much shaped my teaching too. So I work with a lot of ephemeral materials like light, sound, and motion. I work a lot with computation, but I also work a lot with materials and very much hands-on with digital fabrication and much more analog forms of fabrication. I get a lot of my inspiration from working actually directly with materials and understanding mechanical properties, and I love working with robotics just as much as I love practicing within a faculty of architecture, because they're both very holistic, actually, art forms. I find robotics actually very artful and in its holistic nature. Interesting robotics. Not all robotics is interesting, but it can be. And alongside this, I'll just mention this briefly, that I've been teaching on a number of programs at the Bartlett since about 2008. But in 2017, I founded a master's in design for performance and interaction, which is a highly transdisciplinary master's program built really from a collection of individuals I collaborated with in years previously, coming from backgrounds in performance, choreographers and musicians, sound artists, and then also architects and interior designers and computer scientists and neuroscientists and a whole bunch of different people. But I won't show too much about it, but it's out there if you want to have a look at it. The thing I'll mention only briefly about it is the central tenet of the program, which goes to this kind of holistic nature of an architectural education, architecture school, was this idea that we would that the creation of spaces for performance and the creation of performances within them can be some symbiotic activities. So we're not interested in like teaching students how to build standard theaters and just running it, how you build a standard theater running by building code. We're interested in how do you create interesting new types of space or new types of objects or instruments that actually then offer or afford more interesting performance and interaction as a consequence, and could certain aims in a performance actually shape a piece of architecture or an object that's built. So these are the kinds of conversations that were in there. I forgot to put one video in. I forgot to put one video in of work. This is from a student work. Well, this is just some examples of student work, which are responsive objects, generally all sorts of lively things, which we got to present a bunch of projects at the Tate Britain, which is the main national gallery for British art. So we got to take it over for one night. We had about 3,000 visitors who came to see all of these kind of workshops and live sound and live light and kinetic installations and things. So that was a bit of some of the setting up. And there were a range of objects distributed across the Tate Britain that people could engage with, as well as engaging with all the art from the gallery itself. So I was going to begin by just showing you the first lively artifact that I ever exhibited. I titled this lecture Lively Artifacts and didn't explain why, but it might become obvious towards the end. This is a robot. Kristian, you talked about improvisation. So these are robots that improvise performances with these simple tails that change color and can produce different light patterns. And each performance that they generate is a string of ones and zeros that is effectively each performance is one of those strings of ones and zeros. And we test each of those performances on the public and find out which performances are most successful, and that the ones that are successful survive and the ones that are not die out. And this is a genetic algorithm approach to machine learning that I was interested in as a graduate. And these machines compete for attention while people are in the room, but then they also turn to each other when the room is quiet, and they start to perform to each other, and they share the performances, the things that they've learned. And so as a community, they're competing, but they're also collaborating. And this in many ways was a process that was the result of some early work as a student, where I was building my first kind of moving objects. And I built this robotic arm with just a couple of motors that just had an XY axis swinging tail. And suddenly it came to life. This wasn't programmed. I was building it to do light drawings, but there's no programming here. Basically, an analog pin on my microcontroller was reading the static, mostly coming from the lights and the electric heater in the room. And it came to life, basically, because a wire was loose. And I mean, apart from anything, it was terrifying, but it was also a moment of, I think it became a moment of realization later about how much just the random and the environment, how much is in the room already that can actually drive machines. And so, yeah, it's a grainy old video, but it was sort of the beginning of something. And then I was very fortunate to write my thesis with Ranulph Glanville, who introduced me to the history of cybernetics. And this was, you call my red pill moment. I discovered the world of scientists, machine makers, philosophers, and in some cases, performers asking big questions about self-organization and systems, whether they're organic, synthetic, or hybrids of the two. And this included people like Gordon Pask, a maker of learning machines, but also a stage performer involving musicians and electromechanical performers. So I discovered a world of computation that was radically different to my earlier background in digital media. And I've since never really looked back. And the cybernetic brain that Andrew Pickering talks about in relation to people like Gordon Pask's work is it's a performative rather than a kind of cognitive brain. It's immediately engaged in this bodily performance with the going-ons in the world. And this kind of performative perspective on the brain, directly sort of subverts the kind of Cartesian dualism that was rampant in AI and robotics research when at the time of this work, but also at the time of my own studies. And there were people that were pushing against that, like the work of Hod Lipson, for example, Joss Bongard, Rodney Brooks, Carl Sims, and so on, who were more in the kind of artificial life domain rather than in AI. AI was kind of a quite dry computer science world at that time, but the artificial life community were really playing with the kind of performative engagement of machines in spaces as a kind of dance, and as the learning occurred embodied in the space rather than in this is a simulation of a physical movement, but nonetheless these machines were not programmed to move in a certain way. They developed their own strategies for movement, and I found that very interesting. And this is just a photo that I found as a just getting into this world. It seemed to capture something that I was trying to get at, which was this is a photograph by Guillaume Milly. It's just a moment in time between these two fencers. There's a light source at the end of their foils, so you can capture their movements. And right at the top, in the middle of the screen, middle of the image, there's a moment like a wobble, which to me seems like a change and like an adaptation by one to the movements of the other. And to me, it's like a way, almost a moment of capturing interaction in light. There's a moment where there's two actors adapting and reacting and changing and learning and in real time. And that was the model that I was interested in developing in my own work. And that's what led then to work like performative ecologies, which you've already seen. One of the other things that happened at that time, which kind of led me down another rabbit hole, I suppose you could say, was that when I exhibited this work in Sao Paulo for a 3-month exhibition, machines were set up in a line, which was a bit different to how they were originally conceived. And the first robot, as people came in, had a much easier time of attracting people's attention than the ones that were further away. So spaces started to be involved in the learning. And I was excited about it because I got to go away for 3 months, come back to, so when the installation begins, the robots are acting randomly. And then by the time I'd come back 3 months later, each of them had their own kind of movements and characteristics. But the added and unexpected learning from that show was that the people who worked in the gallery had developed quite strong bonds with the robots and had named each one of them and could speak at some length about the individual characteristics of each of the robots in a way that I was not expecting. The fact that these really trivial machines could create such a strong sense of personality in people led me into starting to talk and develop a PhD around what I could learn potentially from working with other disciplines, particularly puppetry initially. This is Ronnie Ledru, who puppeteered some of my own childhood's most famous puppets. So I was working with a guy who basically was the hand inside the sock puppet that I used to watch when I was a child. And then at the same time, I was looking at the early experiments in psychology. Hyder and Simmels were the first to really document in detail how elaborate motivations, intentions, goals could be given to individual rigid objects based solely on their pattern of movement. We might say that's obvious now in animation and so on, but actually it was quite interesting how they were able to sort of parameterize what kinds of movements affected people. And there's a whole body of research in perceptual psychology that just deals with if an object is moving and it changes direction, does it appear more lifelike if it changes 30 degrees rather than 40 degrees? It's really kind of insanely detailed research on what kinds of movement trigger sensations of animacy more than others. And this is all happening around the same time that you're seeing animation before it becomes, industrialized entirely and all the rules get set for how you make an animation. It's actually a really, really interesting space of experimentation and playing with this kind of animate material that had only just become available to artists And there's also there are human beings trying to take on the form of machines and sculpture to explore animation as well in movement. So there's this kind of whole very wide disciplinary interest, well, not transdisciplinary yet, but it became transdisciplinary interest in the kind of liveliness and animacy of the artificial life of machines and so on. Obviously, the Bauhaus was very much, their interests were very much inspired by industrial automation. And 100 years later, we're very much now dealing with what the consequences might be of AI and robotics. So some questions in some ways are repeating themselves that were asked at that time. So I began on a series of machines, basically exploring these quite simple geometric objects moving in space. This was a show at the Pompidou where there was initially a response to the work on, this is the Picasso gallery. That was that was sort of my entry point into the work. This was an example of where I wasn't using learning systems because the show was only for 3 days. It was just a machine so to get the liveliness out of the machines, rather than plugging them full of complex AI, all I did was get them to mirror the behavior of people around them. So I'm measuring people's movements in the space and I'm feeding it back to them. And it gives them the sensation of it being a lively object, but actually I'm presenting their own movement back to them. So this person approaches the machine, the machine turns to them and actually starts to mirror this person's head moving backwards and forwards. It's just one example of that. And this led to a larger show. So this is at the Tate Modern in the tanks. This was a huge cavernous space that I built a long motorized rail to carry this Delta robot through it. So on the left-hand side, you see the image of the robot being tested. On the right, you see the full-size robot. So we just put much longer limbs on it so that it could move over a much wider range, but you can get a sense of how it moves based on the video on the right. And then on the base of that, I put this electroluminescent sheet tetrahedron, which is the only thing that people see really in the gallery. They might see a little bit of these carbon fiber rods hanging through the space. Is that video not going to work? Oh, that's a shame. That's okay. We've got photos. So yes, so you might just see a little bit of the marionette strings, which is the carbon fiber rods, but effectively you only see this floating geometry. And so people enter into the space and they approach this this thing. And if people stand motionless, it sort of hovers motionlessly above you. But as you start to move, it reflects those movements back to you. And as a development upon the earlier mirroring technique I used, this time it had certain triggered behaviors like spinning around people and different kind of preset behaviors that were also based on some psychological research around basic perception of basic behaviors such as chasing, playing, and so on. But I think hopefully this next video will work.
It reminded me of being in one of.
And I'll just explain what it is. So it's the BBC came and filmed the exhibition, and they interviewed the public, which was really, really helpful.
It reminded me of being in one of those scary films.
It reminded me of one of those dreams you have, when aliens sort of invade the Earth, and it seemed something like that. The triangular light came on and it appeared to be following people.
It kind of creeped me out how it knew how people were standing and where to go.
You could see the reactions of all the other people. They weren't quite sure what was going on.
You expect something a bit scary, but then, I don't know, its movements are kind of organic and, I don't know, it seems very friendly.
I really like the last comment because, well, the piece was called Fearful Symmetry. I knew that coming into a dark room with a lot of sound as well, filling the room, that, yes, I worked with a sound artist, and you could hear some of the high-pitched sound in that video. You could hear a bit of the background noise, but it was sort of the whole room was sort of quite intense, and it was dark, and you enter in, and in the distance, you see this light moving and sort of you see people moving up to it and moving it away. But as you get closer and as you start to interact with it, it goes from being this kind of intimidating thing to becoming some playful and this is my favorite photo from the show because you know, a parent is lifting their child up who wants to reach out and touch the light, right? Which is a very stupid thing to do, to actually lift your child into the path of a moving robot, but it nonetheless is this sort of human need for intimacy. And I love this photo. So there's a sort of general there's sort of the success in this work for me was that there's an emotional arc that you come in, you have one set of emotions, but you actually leave with a whole other set of emotions. That's kind of what I was hoping. So this is just how much I've only got a minute and a half. So this is actually just examples of the kinds of things that we build. But this is all student work. I think I want to finish just by talking about robotics, and I can show student work if it comes up, but if you want to make things that move with intelligence or seem like they're alive, actually, you don't have to use AI or robotics. I just qualify that. You can actually use just the sort of passive dynamics of what's the word? Pendulums, which is what these roboticists were doing. Is these are robots that don't have any control systems, that are able to walk and actually walk with a sort of calmness and a relaxedness that's quite hard to achieve with robots. Now, I say that because there's actually quite a lot of most robots that usually walk around looking like they need to go to the toilet. They have a very stiff way that they're walking. And I always love these machines because I've always had a deep interest in the sort of morphological basis of animate movement. Now, this is slightly separate. In fact, this is one of my latest lively artifacts. And this is a video of him just a couple of years ago now, actually. But it's him learning. I didn't, obviously, I couldn't even speak to him at this point, but he was just fascinated with putting the clip into the buckle. And what was interesting was that only a couple of years before that, I'd been looking a lot at the kind of work of people like Peter Abdil, which I find extraordinarily similar to watching my son learning to walk. And these guys are developing robots in a radically different way to how robots have been built for literally for 50 years. Rather than thinking about how you very precisely push an object into another object to fit them together like you would in a kind of classical robotics where it's a geometry problem, these robotics are using touch and movement and multiple attempts to finally find a solution. And then what happens is you get this opportunity to use many of these machines to do the learning. So rather than just one learning how to grasp an object, which can take a very long time to learn, you can put them in a room full of machines doing the same task. Suddenly you have this remarkable scaling up and speed with which, you know, machine intelligence can start to become knowledgeable about the world. And I think this is an area that I'm very interested in, that I won't talk too much about, but I feel like with the amazing access that we have to these machine learning platforms that are APIs and so on, it actually allows us to be able to tap into a lot of extremely powerful learning tools and think about how we can make objects that are not necessarily pre-programmed to act in the world, but actually act, learn, react, and evolve over time. And I think there's plenty of interesting performance opportunities and interaction opportunities that come out of that kind of wedding of machines that can adapt and learn with ourselves, that can obviously adapt and learn. Okay, I'll finish there. 2 minutes over time, but thanks.
That's fascinating and a great sort of arc over a long period of time of your exciting work. The rest of the session is very much based on a conversation, and so you all can have some time to think about your questions. To kick it off, we thought it'd be great to hear from our two speakers some questions or comments about each other's work. So perhaps Elliot, I think.
I'll start. That was a really great presentation. I think something that really stuck with me about what you said, or something I was thinking about, is like what constitutes a successful robotics performance. Especially when you were talking about genetic material. I mean, my brain went straight to eugenics, but I don't know, maybe what do you think about like sort of how would you go back and sort of figure out like which programs get to live and which one get called? Yeah.
So, well, yeah. So I have quite a lot of strong opinions about what good robotics performance work, because there's actually a terribly large amount of bad robotic performance work, like so much of it. And it doesn't mean that there's not useful things to be learned for that person who goes through that process of doing it. So I there's generally value in it, even if the outcomes, and I won't name any names, but there are a few people who like, for example, to dance with robotic arms. And as somebody who's worked with a lot of robots, I immediately understand what are the problems with the way that those robotic arms are built. So those robotic arms are built generally to do movements that are pre-programmed and follow, routines. You can do routine A or routine B or whatever, and you might be able to create some sort of state machine that says, well, if a person's standing here, do routine A or B or C or D, whatever. But what, when you watch people actually dance with a robot, like robot arm, it always feels really just like that the robot is not really responding to the person very much. And it always feels like the dancer's having to work really, if it's a dancer, it could be different kinds of performers, but if it's a dancer, you generally see the dancer working really hard to try and make the performance more interesting, like using their body a lot, moving a lot. And it only makes the impression of the robot being not very impressive even worse, because actually the better that they are at moving, the more useless the robot appears. So I've kind of although I work a lot with performers, I avoid that direct. I've had students working with it, and I've been able to observe the results of that, but I don't do very much work live with performers. But I don't know if that was answering your question, but it was the first, when you said what was good robotic performance stuff, that was the first thought to me, was how little of it there is. And so I've generally ended up using robots in building my own machines, because if you build your own machines, then they don't have all the safety overload systems, all the kind of the junk that slows down the machine, which allows your machine to actually respond in real time. And because it can respond in real time to very, like, even little movements, you can get a much stronger sense of of a sort of dual performance. That's just kind of personal technical experience of that, but I've always found that more successful. It means you end up having to spend 6 months building a robot rather than taking a robot off the shelf that might be ready to work in a day, but you get much better results. But that might change with the developments in robots, I guess. Yeah.
I think that there was something specific around your Bauhaus, the one that was in Brazil, and that the people got to befriend. That genetic, what it meant in that case when some lived and some died, that was what you were telling us, and what that machine learning experiment was about, in terms of mirroring or reflecting back a genetic model or an evolutionary model, or a survival of the fittest Darwinian model.
Yeah. So that's interesting project for me, because there's two types of audience. You've got the audience who come in and come out and leave, and they only see the robot for a few minutes, and they get one kind of experience that is like, oh, it sees me, it's wagging its tail, isn't that cute? And then they go, and maybe they read about it and they actually learn, oh wow, maybe I'll come back in a month's time and see if it's changed. That's possible. But the people who really got to see the work in the most interesting way are the people who were actually maintaining the show, and they were the ones who I had who built the relationship with it. So duration is something that we talk a lot about in architecture, but you don't talk a lot about in new media, not as much in new media, or certainly not in robotics. But I think that building projects that deal with much longer periods of time is where a bit of my architectural training meets my, interest in new media and performance and things that are like live and immediate. And I think that gets missed, or hasn't been explored enough. The possibility of making things in spaces that are changing over glacial, time periods. Yeah. So so I didn't catch all the names. I didn't catch the names of the middle project. I just wrote Mission Impossible down because obviously you're sort of suspended backwards, but just so you know what I'm talking about. I was interested in like that performance and how, you've got the body's interaction with the architecture itself. But I wondered about sort of rehearsal versus performance and how does the relationship change when there's an audience presence, right? How does the space change? How do the audiences change? How do you change as a result? Did you notice any of that when you were between rehearsal and then live performance?
So we did the show 3 nights in a row, and it was a different audience every night. I timed it out with my tech. I can't be up there because of my spine for more than 20 minutes at a time, but the choreographic intent behind that was like actually like a bit like dead. Like I kind of was like imitating like just like a slab of flesh or whatever. So yeah, I think I wasn't like singing or anything from
sorry, no, I didn't quite catch whether you were moving or whether you were. I didn't appreciate that you were static. So I guess or relatively static. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so yeah. I was just hanging. And so how the piece opens is that all the house lights are on and we have a little bit of space there, but there's no music, there's no curtain. It's just like violently bright. And you're just like listening to people shuffle and like cough and drop their keys while they're going to go find their seat.
Wow.
And then the second the last person's seated, we close the door. I get like lowered down. So you just have this sort of like comic like whir, like and I just walk off stage. The house manager does the opening remarks, then it just goes pitch black right after. Yeah.
Wow. So I guess, so maybe then so I'll ask a different question then, because if it wasn't live performance, you talk in architecture, we talk a lot about constraints, like constraints shape the work, right? And I think in performance, you have constraints, of course, as well. Working with performers, I've worked with some performers who talk a lot about the kind of resistance, of the spaces that they're working inside of. And was there anything about the spaces that you've worked in where either physically or kind of conceptually, where that then shaped, your response as a performer? When I say conceptually, whether it's sort of the cultural or historical significance of the spaces, so back to kind of contextual constraints, but is that part of the work then as well? Because
Yeah, that's exclusively how I work, is like kind of like responsible that way. And I feel like that maybe I heard a similar respect in the way that you think about working with machines. It's like it's not really of particular value, sort of making something that just accommodates the technology, but sort of like for me, if my conceptual intervention or sort of architectural intervention with working with the space is thinking about how a viewer will encounter this, that allows me to sort of take more full advantage of just what actually is the material I'm working with, rather than trying to force something on top of a pre-existing architecture. So like for where the piece from Hanging from the Ceiling, that worked because there was one door. And so I designed it so people actually enter in from behind the chairs and have to go around either the left side or the right side, enter through the performance space and then find their seat, or I'm hanging at like head level with them. And then the piece that I did in Switzerland, like I worked with like these sort of like absurdly large, like sort of gallery spaces, and sort of like leaned into this like void where it's like, okay, I'm acknowledging the fact that there's a 20-foot walk from one side of the door to the other. And sort of what does it mean as a viewer to see something go from a black speck So over the course of 5 minutes, like, oh wait, like those are knives, and then like a story sort of comes out. So yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that. That definitely is how anytime I design anything, that's probably the first thought I have making something. Yeah.
What stands out to me in both of your work, you talk a lot about the setting. You've just described how you consider the entire situation of when an audience member steps into a room. You were describing about the angle of where they enter. And Ruairi, we heard from you before that you were unhappy with how they actually set up the robots in Sao Paulo. I think it was different, and that changed the whole project. So I'm curious, perhaps a question to both of you is how, when both of you work with matter, with physical matter, with space, objects, things, that you either imbue with capabilities of behaving in some ways. If you can sort of give us a look behind the curtain of how you work with principles or elements from performance, from theater, also perhaps Ruairi, in the context of your master's program, where you described that you're working with people from a theater background. What are the elements that you find particularly interesting to turn to bring into work with working with technologies, robotic devices, physical spaces, and whatnot?
Why don't you go first, Elliot? I don't know, like.
Okay, I feel that I feel my work is most successful when I'm able to acknowledge the core elements of what something's made out of and leverage that material in a way that supports the ideas behind it, if that makes sense. So I'll use like the brown paint in like the one installation of my PS1 being my skin. Like this is part of like larger research I was doing about a murder case that I'd been studying and made a whole video about it. But I was thinking about like, okay, like what does it mean to be seen not as equal, but sort of as a consumable other? And so I put myself in the position of someone being like, okay, we're all limited within our bodies to our own subjectivity, but there's like a rupture of sort of like mutual acknowledgement when someone feels entitled to like take. And I couldn't, as someone who hasn't and also has no interest in killing another person, it was really hard to kind of wrap my head around being like, okay, thinking about this from a performative lens, it's like, what does it mean to sort of like no longer acknowledge the flesh in front of you as flesh, but actually just see something to take? And so I ended up in all these extended physicalized metaphors, like, where I'm like, okay, like my skin is no longer my skin, it's just a container, you know, in this mind view. Or like thinking about the sculpture where it's my body weight in salt. Like I pick these really big salt crystals that are used in like industrial like pickling and like food drying applications. And so I was thinking about making like a reliquary for like my own body that's not there. And sort of all these sort of gestures are sort of like coming out of this space of being like, how could, you know, someone sort of like do this ultimate transgression, sort of like, how can I kind of find like a visual or conceptual language that, you know, through material and also gesture tries to grapple with that?
Yeah, I think there's so things that I would find most successful is when I manage to sort of suspend people's disbelief for a while. So again, I think a lot of the ideas that I end up discovering, not because I'm thinking about them consciously in the waking of work, but I just discovered that like performance has got all this language to explain the things that are happening in my work. Because I come from an architectural training background and a bit of digital media and new media. That's my sort of education. That's my environment that I work in. But then performance keeps coming up and I'm saying, oh yeah, we thought about this for a while. And I've ended up working with animators, I've worked with puppeteers and animatronics people, and all these different people have got for just really like puppeteers have been thinking about embodied dynamics for much longer than roboticists, for example. Right. Just one example of many where the arts are, I mean, the arts were ahead of, like the artists I showed you, the animators were ahead of the psychologists who were thinking about how objects moving triggers perceptions of life. And it's just too many examples of where the arts have sort of been ahead, but the performance arts I've been particularly, ahead of the scientists and the engineers in thinking about things like, movement, but like, how do you build things that can move? You'd think engineers would be ahead of anybody on that, but they're really not. So anyway, point is that in my sort of meandering through interaction design and architecture, I found, ideas around the suspension of disbelief coming from theater. I got a lot of these ideas about how you curate or you choreograph someone's experience, like going into a theater and sitting down and looking around you and seeing all of those things are part of the performance, right? That's part of the experience. So understanding that knowledge and pulling that into my work has been very valuable. And the other bit was, there's a great artist who works a lot with ambiguity. He's a puppeteer whose name I can't remember this minute, but this idea of, a lot of my work deals with very dark environments and then having things that move in certain ways and how people make them feel. Again, a lot of that just comes from learning about how other people have played with ambiguity and how there's something very visceral when a physical object moves, like clearly like an artificial machine moves in certain ways that feel lifelike, and how people are very viscerally affected by that. So like I showed the work from the Tate, the success for me was the emotional connection that people get to that machine that you can't predict. But all I can do is try and like make the thing move and respond in ways that might feel meaningful to people who are in there. So sorry, that was a meandering answer, but those are, I guess, some thoughts.
Yeah, so interesting. Perhaps let's open it up to questions from the audience. Anyone has some questions for either for speakers or comments or observations or connections with your own work?
So I feel online as well, chat.
There's a chat online as well. Yes, we can start with the chat. Michael, do you want to ask a question directly? If you want to unmute yourself, otherwise I can read it as well. I can read Michael's question. He asks for Elliot, can you tell us more about the influence of this spectacular spectacle when you're conceiving of your work? How do you think about being in dialogue with things that are like superhuman, subhuman, and maintaining engagement with humanity?
The superhuman, subhuman axis, I love. That's where I live in that space. I am deeply cynical, but also like such like a humanist, and sort of I think what inspires me most about choreography, dance, performance, like any kind of like making, it's like even the most like seemingly clinical of offerings, whether it's like industrial design or like robotics, like I love the space where interaction, I don't even know if interaction is the word I'm looking for, but like when individuals kind of come face to face with something that sort of like doesn't traditionally have, or it isn't considered as having like a personality. I'm gonna reel this back in for a second. Yeah, spectacle is something that's like interesting to me because I think I use it a lot as like a way to sort of get people to think about how we engage with our world, which I guess like maybe sounds a bit pedestrian, but my goal is to sort of like expose a lot of the mechanisms that are kind of already on play or at play, either like person to person or person to machine or person to society, and kind of make the unseen seen in that way. I think by sort of like shining a light, for lack of a better term, on the things that maybe we don't pay attention to and making them more spectacular, it pushes us out of the standard and sort of like more into the uncanny, which for me is like the space you're like, oh wait, what is this relation? What is actually happening? Like, what does it mean for me to be in conversation with like, people in a space? So yeah, it might be a bit general, but it's been giving me food in the studio for the past 15 years to try and figure out, how to express that. I don't know if I've gotten there yet.
Just to say, like one of my heroes or group of heroes was Diller Scafidio and Renfro now, but the architects who are perhaps like, for me, one of the best examples of where they've been able to build a very successful architecture firm out of effectively quite a dirty new media installation art performance world that they were, and it grew in scale and all the rest of it, but actually this kind of all the theater technologies that they were working with as they learned ended up feeding into the buildings that they made. But I think that that was their education, was actually to become very good architects. It was the process of working through performance, through kind of interactive reactive objects that they were able to develop their practice. I think that's a really really interesting case study in how architecture can benefit from these kind of cross-disciplinary kind of performance-led practices.
I also think, just to speak to that superhuman subhuman that Michael pulled out, what I've seen of your work, Elliot, there's something that is, it's like shining a light on a very simple gesture that grows in scale and subjectivity, like hanging from the, there aren't a lot of fireworks, there isn't a lot of layers of complexity. It's like that one thing, but that one thing for a long enough time that it blows itself up. It sort of like becomes both base and spectacle. Because when I think about Dillard and Sclafidio, I think about like an immense amount of cloud buildings and Marianne Weems, and I mean just it's an intense amount of work to make that come off as a moment, like a singular gesture, if you will. Whereas even in the performance work that you described yesterday with the class, it's sort of like these small interactions that it's just like, but look at it, that are I don't know what subhuman even actually means, but I mean, the classic, like, what is spectacle, and what you're sort of like, I'm going to take this idea of spectacle and I'm going to twist it just to like the breath that comes out of the back end of a motorcycle. Yeah. And that's it. You know what I mean? But that's it for a long time. And that duration actually, the simplicity combined with the duration turns it somehow into this this provocation, this question, and the relationship that we have with the, let's call it the built environment, as opposed to sort of the kind of intense fantasy of cloud buildings and that kind of thing. Not as a judgment call, but just as a really different approach to spectacle building, if you will, with humans and the objects we live with.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, do you have a person? Oh, sorry.
Danny. Oh, or somebody else. Sorry.
Okay. Hi, I'm Danny Snyder-Young. I'm an associate professor of theater, and I'm an audience researcher. So both of you were gesturing to the meaning making and the human behavior that your artistic work invites. So how are you thinking about audience agency in those structures and invitations?
Ruairi, I feel like such a perfect inroad for that. I don't know, to start.
So, well, I mean, just the way I've been thinking about it since I got really interested in cybernetics. Really, I actually had years of work having very classically trained in sort of web development and like websites and CD-ROMs, and we called them interactive CD-ROMs back then, and they weren't interactive. They were just like button pressing to activate a video or activate sound. But that was interactive. So I did interactive design, and nobody at any time asked the question like, what does interactivity mean? And it was only when I went and studied architecture, and then I met some like professors who'd been educated themselves in the 1960s by Gordon Pask, that I got opened up to this idea that actually there's this much, much richer model of interaction that it doesn't require advanced technology, because people were building these machines in the 1960s, but it shifts the idea to it's not a user slave model. It's that we're all participants in that space together, and and his Colloquy of Mobiles at the ICA and his Musicolor are two installations that are like radical pieces of like performance installation work, decades ahead of anything else I can think of. And so yeah, so the things I've been building have just been sort of, you know, just building upon those ideas and trying to look for every opportunity where the audiences become participants, and that the machines, and using a variety of different techniques, also have the potential to not just react but adapt and change in ways that are interesting for me, or hopefully interesting for the audiences. But yeah, it's absolutely at the center of everything I've been interested in ever since I had that leap. That didn't come from an interaction design program that I was on. It came from an architecture school program that I was on. Yeah, it was kind of interesting.
I feel like for me, it comes from music, actually. So I grew up as a pianist and would perform a lot. But also when I was like very, very small, my grandmother was a pipe organ player. And so I can't tell you how much on like a near psychic level, like how impactful it was to like now in my understanding of like the proscenium and stuff, like thinking about like a woman going behind the back of a church up to a second level to play an organ that's like out of view, but sort of is so loud and all encompassing, and kind of like affects the whole like texture of like a gathering. But it's kind of like everywhere but nowhere at the same time. She taught me how to play piano, but then even from then, like thinking about like recitals. And once I started doing independent performances, I played in bands for years. It's sort of like, yeah, this thinking about like a bar or a club or a DIY space. So it's just like, I've set up so many AV systems, I never want to do it again. But it's a thing, it's like, okay, like where are we not gonna get feedback? Where's the audience gonna come in? Like, I don't want to be too close to the bar. These things that sound simple, but actually like train like a really deep sensitivity that I now realize that I've been growing up with since the time I was like a little kid up until now. And that learning, that base is just like continuing to expand now. It's like my professional work, where I get to kind of explore these ideas differently, but also at a larger scale too.
Yeah, the only thing I was thinking, just to mention one thing, was I think it's, for me personally, the idea of the audience being kind of active participants is partially an aesthetic thing for me, is that I find my work more personally interesting, or I can maintain my attention of my own work if my work is performing in ways that I wasn't expecting. So, because I get very bored of the things that I've made that are just predictable. So just being able to come back and see my show 3 months later and it's different than when I left it, for me is like, keeps me interested in that work, right? Rather than wanting to sort of move on to the next piece, I'm willing to show it a few times in different arrangements to see what plays out. So yeah, it's a personal aesthetic thing for me to keep me interested.
Robert, we've seen, Ruairi, that have started already with your first project where your robotic arms seem to jab at you unexpectedly and try to punch you.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, random can also be quite interesting. Anyway.
I would have one more thing too. I'm also obsessed with retail as well, like retail spaces and how that can classify as like an audience engagement too. Is like an obsession of mine right now. But just an aside. Yeah.
Well, just perhaps you can expand on that, because that touches on Maria's question actually. And we'll get to it in a second. Maria's question online was asking exactly if you were talking about performance, architecture, design, and in the context of performing arts, there has actually been this move out of traditional art spaces into everyday environments. And we've seen somehow your work in traditional art spaces in many ways. You've talked a bit about real retail environments.
Yeah.
I was wondering where you see this kind of work that you both involved in doing permeate into everyday contexts and situations.
Yeah, I never do anything without thinking about who's coming to see it. And so I think it's really fun to think about like a store or like a restaurant or any kind of like public space as like a zone of hosting. I'm not gonna use the word community, but like hosting sort of like a public within the space. And again, like whatever capitalism bad aside, I do think it's actually important to sort of like acknowledge like who we're hosting into our spaces. And yeah, our architecture has dealt with that a lot, thinking about like, I mean, there's codes, right? Like how far columns can be from like an exit, or like you can calculate like a temperature of a room based on how many people, like there's that stuff. But I think that there is a bit of sensitivity that's perhaps missing from a lot of people's designs. For the public, that I don't see as frivolous and actually kind of see as like an exciting creative and like design challenge. Yeah.
Perhaps let's hear two questions, few other questions that perhaps our speakers can respond to.
Going off of what you just said, actually, both of you, do you feel like you kind of like play into the expectations, like you were saying with the motorcycles, with you exhaling? I'm assuming when approaching the room, they see it, they can hear that access, so they have like some expectations. And when you're saying, as Rory was saying before, with like making the floating light, like this music, making it like, kind of scary, like you're playing. You have like goals when you have the expectations in mind of what you're trying to accomplish there.
Let's hear your question as well, then perhaps.
No, yeah, mine was actually pretty similar to the one you read out about like how do you see these like works outside of the museum space and in like real life, like is more in the day-to-day, like we were talking about cities and like those being more like reactive to people. Especially Rory's work is really similar to a project we're working on right now with improvisation design, looking at lights and how they move or change colors depending on like environmental factors. So yeah, that was the question.
Yeah, Rory, perhaps.
Well, yeah, so the main reason I started a master's program was because I had like all these interesting, I wanted to like parallel process, you know, all of the possible ways you could use these technologies in different contexts, including many different, you know, public spaces. So there's urban scale work, there's architectural scale, there's interiors, there's performance. All of these things are happening in parallel. So it's very difficult for me to answer that question in any sort of specific way because every context shapes that work in so many different ways. But how will I try? I guess I'll just say that in my own work, I've done a number of projects in public spaces where there's always like an attempt to have a conversation with the people who use that space. So I'll give you one example. So there was, I built this polite piece of lobby art basically for Arab engineers. And the project is called Balls. And it's basically 49 balls of light that go up and down inside of their atrium. It's pretty and it won the gig, fine. But we built a piece of software and you can do like patterns of light and movement and yada, 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 and ticked all the boxes for the people who were doing the competition. But the project that was interesting for me was the software that ran Balls was open source and anybody in the building could download it and run it and take over the installation. And this was a building full of engineers. So we did all sorts of fun stuff. Guys were like using environmental data and displaying it in the middle of the building. People were doing like sensors and like puppeteering it with their hands. So lots of unexpected projects came out of it. It was on the World Cup was going on. I think it even reacted when somebody scored a goal when the World Cup was playing. So it was kind of really weird range of different things. But the idea was the message I wanted to get into Arab was about, I have very kind of strong, and I'm interested, Kristian, I think we could probably have a long conversation about like the issues that go around smart buildings, smart cities, about the proprietary nature of which the technology is built and how not open it is, right? And a lot of my work has been around using open source tools. So I'm very much driven by this open source agenda. And so for me, building an installation, I wanted the engineers in the building to have a conversation with them about open source. But to do that, I had to do that via sort of polite lobby art. So that's one example of where, you know, I think that the work can do multiple things, but, you know, you do want to try and talk to somebody in that space about what you're doing, what the technologies might mean in the future.
That was such an interesting addition, I think, to the project that we've seen before, in fact, the backstory to that. Expectations was the other question about audience expectations, how that factors into your work.
Yeah, I think I can probably respond like both of yours at the same time. But I think that it would be, yes, like I think about that a lot in my work. And then I also feel that like the sensitivity and awareness I've kind of been training over the past couple of years would lend itself really well to, designing interiors, like landscape and also like event design as well. So I think that a theater term that is really useful in these spaces is like dramaturgy, like sort of like how when you're entering into a venue, does your experience of like the space even something as simple as being like, okay, I wouldn't wanna have an information booth like on the 3rd floor around the corner in the back, but when people really don't think about that stuff. And I'm sure we've all been to some really unfortunate, venues in our lives where it's just like, I can't, who did this? Who hurt you, like, why did you do that? So I think that is a space where it's like, it actually, I think being trained in sort of like a performance logic, like a choreographic logic, but also just like kind of being acutely aware of just like what it means to sort of like welcome like the end user or the guest into a space is important for any kind of like shared venue, whether it's indoors, outdoors, or even just thinking about like a wedding or something, like where like if you have people in one space and go to another space, it's like you really, like you were talking about how when you see robots and they're just like poorly made, like how that's all you can think about. I think about that when it's just like, oh my, I can't believe someone made me walk through the space to check in, then you have to go back out through the front door, then you start here, it's just like, no, bad, this is all wrong. So they're little things that can change, but for people that are aware of just like how much better things could be, it's kind of all we could think about, so. Yeah,
and can I just take a bit more to your yes answer to audience consideration in terms of or expectation? And here you a bit talk about how you work with audience expectation and why.
Yeah.
Audience expectation, I guess there's always an expectation that differs. There are many different expectations. I guess there can be different ways of meeting those expectations, betraying those expectations. In other ways, can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I have seen thousands of shows, if not tens of thousands of shows, and when something is bad, it's all I can think about, or when something doesn't work. So I kind of run through just like different like, I can just like imagine, okay, if I were to do this, or I was gonna come in like, oh, like how would I encounter this? So it doesn't bother me when people do something unexpected, like it's actually kind of exciting, but I feel like when people don't consider the permutations of the space they're inventing, it just shows like a lack of care for the audience that they're hosting. That's all. It's like I have zero interest in like forcing someone to do anything. Like I couldn't if I wanted to, but it's just like, okay, how can I sort of like either subconsciously or structurally not influence, but just sort of like name ways that people could interact with the space if they want to. Or like, I wouldn't, if I want people to like focus where we're sitting, it's like, I wouldn't have like a chocolate fountain in the corner, you know what I mean? It's just like, that was like a sloppy example, which is okay, maybe I'd bring the chocolate fountain a little closer. So it's like, even if someone didn't want to be on stage, like I'm signaling through like my work, like, all right, this is a space that you may want to gather. So when the piece starts, you'll be near the focal point.
We have time for another question.
I have one, and I close that.
Right after.
We heard about context is important and the environment and all of that. But then most of the things that we've seen, they are staged, meaning objects put in a predefined context that then impact the way things performance. So I don't know. It's hard to me to understand how can you understand how an object perform you if you put it in a stage that is predefined, and so it would be completely different than if I encounter that object in a different context, right? So how does this work? So how do you can really understand what is the performative capability of an object if you put it in this predefined stage and there is no. I don't know if it makes sense, but this relationship between object and context, and then it's or you design both, like the object and the context you place in it, like the object in. So it's a system. So it's.
I think my quick response to that, and I'm sure you two have more, you three, is this idea that Kristian started with the performative turn. So it's not like either it's in a stage or it's like I find it in a retail shop, or either it's in a museum or I'm walking down the street and oh my God, there's something coming at me. I'm thinking the performative turn allows us to think about like the amplification of different kinds of spaces. So you expect when you go into a theater, there's going to be some performance. And so you work with those constraints the constraint of the space, the constraint of or the wonderful opportunities that you can make out of what that space is. But I guess the performative turn means like it's a gradient, like it's an amplification or they're all performative spaces, I think is the idea. It's just with some expectations in some and less expectations in others, but still someone's watching it. You're watching it watch you, someone's watching you watch it. Do you see what I mean? Like there's always something, unless you do it by yourself, like, and even then, what's happening? Do you know what I mean? So I think that it's somehow the gradient idea is helpful to me versus like it's a discrete place where this happens and then there's another discrete place where like what regular life happens and I'm like no, you know what I mean? So that's helpful. I don't know. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, all I could think of too is like a doorknob. Like what I mean by that is just like it's an object that's telling you how it needs to be used. That's sort of like restricted to its context, but also kind of supersedes any potential context at all. And so if you put a lever on the floor, not in connection to a door, you can maybe recognize it as something that's not fulfilling its purpose, but you know that it has a utilitarian function. So I don't know, I feel like it's really, it could be that simple. The ways that an object is performing upon us because the expectation of its proper use is something that's sort of understood by the viewer. And the way that it's either being used properly or improperly can influence how we engage with it.
Affordances.
Yeah.
Ruairi, anything to add from your side?
No, I mean, yeah, I agree with everything that's just been said.
All right, thanks for bringing us back to the title of today's conversation. Great, thank you to Ruairi for taking the time and joining us and sharing your work, to Elliot for being here with us and also working with the PhD program, and for all of you coming to join us here at the Center for Design for hosting us.
Yeah, hope to see you all again for the design research.
Thank you.
Bye, Ruairi.
Thanks so much for here. I'd love to have you here. Be in touch.
Thanks, guys. That was great. Really enjoyed that conversation. All the best.
Bye-bye. Take care.